Hi there, welcome to another episode of Q&A about science and technology for kids and others. Let's see, I have a bunch of questions that came in here. Where should we start? Susie asks, how would I think about replacing textbooks in education? What are some better tools for the classroom? Well, let's see. I mean, there's several different things to say here. There's kind of the broadcast way of getting facts and knowledge, and there's the doing things for yourselves kind of part of it. I've certainly spent a lot of time building tools to let people do things for themselves, whether that's Wolfram Alpha, whether that's Wolfram Language, to get to the point where once you have a way of conceptualizing something, you can see the consequences of that as automatically as possible. Actually, with our new notebook assistant, it's become even easier. Once you have sort of a concept of what you want to do, you ask the notebook assistant to do it, and it will give you a piece of Wolfram language code that you can then look at, see its consequences, and so on. I think the best way to learn stuff is to sort of participate in doing it, so to speak. It's a certain amount of that is a question of sort of running it in your own mind, but another part of it is learning to use the tools that you can expect to use for forever, that let you go from something you understand to something that is that you can kind of work out in the world. Whether it's you are sort of wonder, you're studying, you know, the some feature of geography or something, and then you can say, well, I wonder what you know what the sizes of mountains in this particular area are, or something like that. Then you can just define that, perhaps using Notebook Assistant, and produce a piece of computational language, Wolfram language, that asks that question, then get the answer, then sort of integrate that into what you're thinking about. But or a zillion other examples. If you're studying math or something like this, try out examples, see what happens. Now, there's the question of sort of how do you get the facts to begin with, so to speak? And I would say that it's important. You know, the thing that I kind of keep on realizing and emphasizing is, in the end, the way that you get a lot of leverage is through understanding, intuition, kind of the sort of the big picture. But that's all built on the basis of just facts, things to know. I mean, as you all perhaps have noticed from these live streams, you know, in the course of my life, I've accumulated a decent number of facts and things I know. And that's really critical in being able to sort of do things at a conceptual level. That's the sort of foundation on which you can kind of build up your thinking in different areas. So I would say, but now there's a question of sort of how do you learn those facts? And for me, I tend to learn them best in the context of something I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to do, and they sort of come along for the ride, rather than, you know, in my adult life, at least, I really haven't memorized very many facts. I think I'm sort of I find it hard to remember things unless they sort of fit into things that I was otherwise trying to do. But particularly when one's sort of starting out and one doesn't know any of these facts, it's kind of like, well, just, you know, you have to read them, learn them somewhere. And I think that I mean, I have to say, when I'm motivated to learn a subject, I'm absolutely happy to read the textbook of that subject, so to speak. But I have to have my own internal motivation. That's sort of a quirk of mine, so to speak, not shared by lots of other people. But in terms of sort of where do you get the facts? You know, I like reading stuff. Other people like watching videos. Those are two sort of common mechanisms to get facts. And I would say that the quality of kind of both textbook-like material, and by textbook-like material, I include kind of good definitive websites and so on, that both that and the quality of videos and kind of explanations by video and so on, both of these have improved significantly, I would say. And they went from something which could be very ponderous in the past to something which is quite clean and to the point in most cases today. So that's That's sort of one branch. Another branch is, okay, what about actually using the computer to learn stuff? That's been something people have been trying for, I don't know, 60 years at least. It's not worked very well in the past of having something where you are going back and forth learning something with the computer. Some things have worked when it comes to kind of sort of here's a quiz, do this quiz, check off the multiple choice things. I think that's worked okay. Gamifying that works for some people, not for others. A thing that we've been trying to build up over the last year or two, year actually, a year and a bit, is kind of a serious effort to build a sort of fully engaging sort of AI-based tutor that can actually teach things interactively to people. And we've been building that at first for Algebra 1, and then we have a framework that allows us to build that for a whole bunch of other kinds of courses. What is this like? Well, to the user, it's like it kind of looks a little bit like a book in the sense that it has those sections and you're going through different things. But then when you actually start interacting with it, you can really have a conversation and you can ask almost anything. And when it asks you questions, you can respond not just in the kind of structured way that has sort of traditionally been necessary, but in whatever kind of narrative way you want. You can really have a conversation, and you can have a conversation. You can say, well, I don't really want to learn algebra because the only thing I'm actually interested in is gardening, and the thing will probably do a pretty reasonable job of explaining why algebra, why you can formulate algebra questions in terms of gardening, and why if all you care about is gardening, you still might find algebra interesting, so to speak. It does a really good job, I think, of successfully personalizing things to the person who's interacting with it. And I think it does a reasonable job of kind of keeping things on track and kind of having reasonable ways to respond when the student sort of gets something wrong. It does reasonably well at understanding what is the confusion that the student has and sort of explaining its way around that. So I'm sort of guessing that we'll see whether the sort of AI tutors, the technology stack we've been building, we'll see how much of that ends up being of the picture in what is in the way that sort of education is delivered. I would say that books, by the way, still, in my view, very much have their place. I mean, the thing that when you go to a website and it's like the thing can have tentacles as far down as you want. But if you have a book, ultimately you can pick up the book. It's 400 pages of information about this topic. It's organized in a systematic way. It has, a table of contents. You kind of know you're partway through it. It's a good way to absorb knowledge. I mean, it's a way of absorbing knowledge that has existed pretty much throughout the time that knowledge has been communicated in written form, and it's a pretty good way of doing it. It's not quite bite-sized, it's pretty big, but it's a known size way of delivering knowledge, and I think that's a worthwhile thing, regardless of whether it's bound with sheets of paper or whether it happens to be delivered in an electronic form. It doesn't really make much difference. It is this sort of packaged thing that provides you a bunch of knowledge, and I think that's useful. I would say that in modern times with sort of AI tutors and so on, it's once you have the book as a backbone, there's sort of much more of talk to the book, have something work with you to go through sort of book-like content. That seems to be the way that things are going. We'll see how well it works. There have been, as I say, many failures in this effort to sort of computerize the method of engagement with students on educational content. I think we're in a new era at this point, but we can't know until we've really systematically tried it, and hopefully that will be something that starts up very soon. Let's see. There's a question here from Golly. Can you teach us how to be scientists? What's the first step? Well, knowing a bunch of stuff about science is a useful thing. That's different from being a scientist. You can know a lot of stuff and be able to sort of pass every test and still not be able to, quote, do science. You can know all the existing science, but not be able to do any new science. I think the thing that is sort of the challenge in doing new science is sort of the challenge of doing a new anything. You're kind of going from nothing or just an idea to a thing that you build in the world, so to speak. And it's a really great experience to have, to kind of go. It tends to be the case that sort of in the educational setting, you're given things which are always on rails, on a track. It's like you're going to do this. You've got 10 questions. You're going to answer those 10 questions. But the thing that doing science, for example, as a scientist is all about is, or should be about at least, is going from sort of just an idea to something that you figure out, learn, work out in the world. It's something where there aren't rails. You don't know what's going to happen. If you know what's going to happen, then it isn't really sort of research science at that point. It's something different. It's doing an exercise or whatever else. Now, I mean, I will have to say that an awful lot of the journals of academic science are full of people who are sort of doing science still on rails, so to speak. They're doing things that are very incremental. It's like, well, they built up, they know how to do this kind of a thing. They're going to turn that crank one more time on one more different situation or one more thing that's arisen in the world. That isn't, to my mind, the much sort of better way, the more productive way to do science is sort of creative science, where you are really trying to create new things that nobody had thought of before, rather than just do procedural science, kind of following, we measured this thing for 300 kinds of chemicals. Let's measure it for the next 50 chemicals or something. But that's not to say that isn't worth doing, but that isn't sort of the creative science branch. That's kind of more procedural science, and the world needs plenty of that. Some of it can be automated, but it still needs plenty of human effort to do those kinds of things. But if the question is, how can you get to be sort of a creative scientist, that's a different story. And the sort of the dominant effect is, how do you learn to go from nothing to something for any project? And I would say that part of that story is, well, pick a project that's actually going to work out. Pick a project that isn't like kind of, well, I wouldn't recommend sort of find the fundamental theory of physics as a first project to do if you're learning to be a scientist. Sadly, one sees a lot of people who do try and pick that kind of project as sort of a first project to do in trying to be a scientist, and it doesn't work out because that project is really hard, and you have to know a whole bunch of existing science to even get to the starting gate for a project like that. So you kind of want to pull back from that. And I would say that many projects that at first seem like, oh, that's kind of trivial, but actually nobody knows the answer to that. Those are great projects. Things that are sort of everyday questions where, well, nobody really quite knows the answer, actually, if you drill down and see. And I would say that a good place to start, as I say, that one of the principal things is find a problem, a project that you really want to do. And, maybe you'll discover after you get really into it, well, this particular project has been kind of done by the people before, at least in some form. Maybe there's a version of it that hasn't been done. Maybe there's a particular slant that is new. I'm not sure that matters so much in sort of getting started in science, because it's the effort to try and sort of climb that hill. It's the climbing that matters rather than the being on the top of the hill, at least at the beginning. And I think sort of another thing to say is you have some question, and it's like really try and drill it all the way down. Don't sort of just say, well, I've got the superficial answer here. Just see whether you can get to the point where you know everything that's known about that question, what the world has to say about that. And it might be a very narrow question, but you've really gotten all the way down. You've read everything people have written about it. You've figured out things for yourself about it. You've kind of worked that little area out. I think there's a great value in working out anything sort of in its greatest detail, perhaps more so than saying, I'm going to take this broader thing and I'm going to sort of superficially learn about those particular things. There's a value to sort of digging deep in a particular area. I mean, when people go on and get PhDs and so on, that's one of the things that sort of an important piece that comes out of it is you took something and you kind of took it a long way, so to speak. And you don't need to go through the many years of getting a PhD to have some experience like that. You get that with any sort of project that you've picked, that you kind of drill it all the way, so to speak. I would say that, in terms of doing science, the tools you use, I mean, I have to say here, I've spent the last, I don't know, 45 years building a collection of tools that have let me be, I think, rather efficient as a scientist. And, sort of the good news is those tools exist as things that anyone in the world can use. I'm talking about Wolfram language particularly. It's a way of kind of taking what you're thinking about and sort of crispening it up to be able to get a computer to understand it using this kind of medium of Wolfram language, and then being able to let the computer give you that leverage to work things out. And what's really great about that situation is that it's just incredibly easy to work out things that nobody has ever worked out before. It's, you can be sitting down and typing something in Wolfram language, even if it's doing something in some area of math or something like that, which is a pretty well worked out area. You are very quickly at the point where you're dealing with things where you can be pretty confident that nobody ever went there before, and that's a neat thing, and it's something where also the very effort to take the thing you're thinking about and crispen it up so that you can tell the computer what you're talking about. That's an important step, and it's become easier with our notebook assistant that came out a few months ago, that you can kind of describe things pretty vaguely and it'll start generating sort of precise, crisp computational representations. I would say another thing about sort of the become a scientist story is explain what you're talking about. Try and write an exposition of what you're talking about. Even very early in the process of researching something, try and write some exposition. Maybe you'll guess what will come out of what you investigate, or maybe you're just writing something which introduces what you're doing for your own sake and other people's sake. I've certainly always found that that's the time when I really start to understand things. And as I start to try to explain things, I realize, whoops, there's a piece I don't understand here. Well, that's the thing I have to work on. And that sort of helps define the direction that you're going to actually make forward progress with the science. And I think also, at least in my way of doing these things, unless you can explain it clearly, you didn't really do it. You didn't really get there. You're still sort of flailing around. It's as soon as you really have managed to get to the top of that hill, so to speak, you can explain what you're doing. And whenever sort of I try and cut corners on that, those are the places where I realize later, gosh, I should have investigated that. That was sort of a chink in the armor of what I was building. So a few thoughts on sort of how to become a scientist or something. I would say that sort of the effort to write exposition, I perhaps should say that, the effort to write exposition is really worthwhile, even if it's sort of a topic where you're not adding that much new. But you know what? If you're writing an exposition in the form of a computational essay, or you're mixing words together with computational language, by the very act of doing that, you're doing something new. And the things that you can compute with that computational language are pretty much guaranteed to be new, even if the thing you're writing about is something that's hundreds of years old. By the time you've put it in computational language, got a computer to help you, you're making, pictures that nobody made before that probably help explain the topic that you're talking about and give you that experience of going from just an idea to sort of a concrete, real thing in the world, which I think is the key sort of psychological step in being able to do science, to have the idea that you can just invent stuff. You can figure things out that haven't been figured out before. And I think that's the story as I see it. I mean, I think that the thing that tends to be part of standardized education, which is do this exercise, do this exercise, do this exercise. Personally, I think that is somewhat different from the goal of become a creative scientist. It's much more part of the learn the facts and learn them well enough that when you need that fact, you can immediately remember it and trot it out, so to speak. that's a thing for which it's worthwhile to do this kind of practice and exercise and so on. But in terms of the experience of doing creative science, it's not so much related to that. That's kind of, learn the facts, learn some methods. Some of the methods you learn, maybe you don't even need to learn these days because we've got computational language that just does them, and you don't really need to learn in detail how to do them. What you need is an intuition about how they are done and what comes out from doing them, rather than the mechanical details of how to do them. It's not, it must be decades since I last, did an integral by hand. It's many, many decades, almost half a century since I last, yeah, pretty close actually, since I last, sort of did some trig substitution, work out an integral, even though I've used integrals a zillion times in the intervening half century. But the mechanics of how to do them was always done by computer. And so it is with many other kinds of things that if you start asking me about sort of intuition about how integrals work, and is this thing, do I think that, x to the x will have some nice integral in symbolic form? Yeah, I think it will. If I ask me, does sine of x have some nice form of integral? I think the answer is not quite. I mean, I know that particular one, it comes out in terms of some very exotic mathematical function. But, what I think, even though I've never, for half a century, I've not done the integrals with my own hands, so to speak. The fact that I've seen so many be done and got the experience of seeing that happen is something which has given me a lot of intuition for how these things work, which to me is the more powerful kind of human thing to have than that purely mechanical skill. But it is also the case that, when you start saying, well, gosh, the integral of sine of x, I think it comes out in terms of an appel F1 function, which is a type of generalized hypergeometric function. So that's a bunch of complicated words. And, I know what those words mean, and those are sort of on the fact side of learning things. And that's worth learning, because if you don't know those facts, you kind of can't build up this kind of conceptual structure that allows you to understand more things. So a few comments on sort of the problem of becoming a scientist. I will say that we do this summer school for grown-ups and a summer research program for high school students and another one for middle school students every year. That is an attempt to put into practice the kinds of things I'm talking about. Each person kind of gets to do their own sort of original project. I guess my role is often to come up with all of those projects, with the topics for all of those projects, interacting with the people to say, what's a good fit for this person to do what project. It's quite an interesting exercise for me. And also, some of the time, it lets me get projects that I've wondered about for years actually done. But although I would say that's the minority case, it's usually something that I've never thought about, but talking to a particular student, I'm like, that would be an interesting thing to figure out. But that's a place where we see, you can see all the projects that have gotten done in those programs on the web. We've been running those programs for a long time, the summer school for 23 years now, I think. And you can see those projects on the web, and it's an interesting example of sort of going from, in each case, going from absolutely nothing, from just an idea to, in that case, a finished project in a few weeks. So that's the story there. Let's see. Gustavo comments, intellectual curiosity is required to be a good scientist, and moral character to stand to what you find, even if it's controversial. Yeah, those are complicated issues. I mean, certainly you have to have things you want to figure out. If you don't have things you want to figure out, you're not going to be you're not going to have a good time as a creative scientist, because it's hard work. It's, you're trying to climb these hills all the time. You're trying to figure out things you haven't figured out. And it's not, you have to have a certain degree of tenacity to make that work. And you have to care enough to make it work. And people have different motivations. I mean, some people are motivated more by the pure sort of joy of finding things out and understanding things. Other people more by the, well, there's this competitor that I have who's trying to do this, and I'm going to race to the end first. Different kinds of motivations. I happen to be very firmly in the first sort of camp of those motivations, and I'm put off by the second camp. But other people are motivated in different ways, and I don't think there's a right answer to that. I think that this question of standing by what you find, even if it's controversial, that is a very complicated issue. It's when you do science, and this is more relevant after you sort of got started and you're really discovering things and so on. You have to have some idea what you're going to discover, otherwise you're never going to go look there. But then you actually go and try and do the computer experiment, do the physical experiment, do the figuring out, whatever it is. And the chips are going to fall somewhere. You're going to discover something. As I say, if you had no idea what you were going to discover, you would never have done it in the first place. So you have to have some idea, in a sense, prejudice about what you're going to find before you start looking, because otherwise you're not going to look. But then you actually do the looking and you find something, and what you find may or may not agree with what you thought you were going to find. And one of the things that is psychologically difficult in doing science is the chips will fall where they fall, and you have to just go with them. And this is where people get in a lot of trouble doing science, where they say, but I thought it was going to go this way, and I'm going to tweak the data just a little bit, and I'm going to, exclude the mouse that didn't seem like it was happy that day, or I'm going to do this or that or the other, and sort of fudge things to get to what I thought was going to happen. And that's how you end up doing sort of bad science. So it's sort of a psychological thing. You have to feel like what you're interested in is whatever is true. And when the chips fall in a way that wasn't what you expected, in a sense, sometimes that's when you should be happiest, because then you learned something. It wasn't just, oh, I knew that was going to be the case. You learned something new. But it is psychologically difficult because you believe something is going to work out in a particular way and it doesn't. And it's like, well, I thought I was going to make progress, but I didn't, and so on. My own experience has been, if you let the chips fall where they fall, it usually comes out even better in the end. Even if at first it seemed like, oh gosh, I didn't manage to get what I wanted to get, it's all a big lose. My experience has been that just sort of going for the truth, so to speak, you end up coming out much further ahead, independent of the fact that you're doing good science. It just turns out that the truth is always a bit stranger than you expect and ends up leading you to a place that is more interesting than you expected. But it is a psychologically challenging thing. The other thing that happens is people will say, oh, one feature of doing creative science is that you're doing something new. And to most people, it's like, well, it's new. Can it be right? Is it worth doing? It goes against conventional wisdom, perhaps. People can be very negative about that. And you have to have a high degree of confidence or a high degree of not caringness to persist through that. That's most relevant when you're doing really sort of high-end science and doing big things and so on, because when you're doing smaller things, mostly people just don't care. And often, and certainly in my earlier times in science, and even sometimes now, I feel better doing things where I care, but nobody else cares. And so nobody's going to say to me, wait a minute, this is terrible. We need to fight back, so to speak, because it's just, I'm doing a thing that nobody cares about. So nobody is there to kind of wants to fight it. But that's a yet different thing. I mean, when you do really sort of high-end creative science, it is a challenging thing that people, if you're really doing something new, there will be people who tell you that can't possibly be right, that's not worth doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's something where you kind of have to have developed a certain degree of either personal confidence or just, look, I'm just doing this for fun and I don't really care what you think type thing to persist with that. I will say, in terms of the sort of how to be a scientist, this question of where you find a problem to explore, it's the most fertile areas are the areas where the least has been done, so to speak. It's often either between two existing fields where there's sort of no link between them, or more importantly, it's places where some new methodology or new set of ideas or new capability in the world just opened up this new area that you can then go into. And the whole story of computational language and sort of computation in general is a big opening up of many, many, many things. That to take sort of something which hasn't been computational before and make it computational is a way to sort of get into that sort of new open area that that is sort of a guaranteed place where you're going to find interesting things. Let's see. Weasel is commenting, if you can explain it something in simple terms, then you understand it. Yes, that is what I find both internally and externally, in the sense that I feel like that's the way that I can be confident that I understand the thing myself and can build on the thing that I understood and build something on top of it. And the worst thing is you've got something, you don't really understand it, you build the next thing on top, you build the next thing on top, and it's sort of it's a building built on sand, so to speak, and eventually the whole thing comes toppling over. And when it comes to interacting with other people about science and so on, it is certainly my repeated experience that, I tend to try to understand, can I really get to the point where I really understand what the person is saying? Once I do, I'm pretty confident. And, when somebody says, does that person make any sense? I'll say, absolutely. If I don't get to that point, if I'm still sort of flapping around and sort of hearing the words and knowing what the words mean, but not really understanding what the point is, what the trunk of what's being said, then I'm very unconfident, and I will usually eventually conclude, if I put enough effort into it and I just can't understand it, I'll usually conclude that it just doesn't make any sense. It's kind of nonsense. Let's see. Let's see, a few questions here. I'm going to go back to some others here. The question here, Des is commenting, I wanted to be a scientist as a kid, but was actively discouraged from doing that. What would you tell a kid to encourage them? Well, I'm not sure that every kid should be encouraged to be a scientist. I mean, it's hard work. It's fun if you like it. I think that the thing that is often encouraging is just to talk about questions. Why is this way? How does this really work? And if you're interacting with kids and you might know more or more, have a better way of thinking about things or whatever, it's just like posing those questions, which probably you don't know the answer to as well, and sort of working through those with a kid is a very good way to kind of get people the experience of sort of going from not knowing something to knowing something and being able to work things out. I think to me, that's one of the more encouraging things to be able to do. I would say that, depending on, if you do computer experiments, do physical experiments, if you as a kid or a kid you're dealing with sort of gets excited about those things, gets to the point where they can sort of mechanically do them, and then they're off doing them, then you're on a track. Then you're on the kind of, that's a science track. Now, in terms of sort of the dynamics of the world, and can you make a living being a scientist? That's a complicated story. I mean, these days, professors get paid awfully well, I think, at least at fancier schools, at least in the US. I mean, it used to be the case that was kind of a very sort of a poor way to make a living. I don't think that's as nearly as true anymore. I mean, it's not if you're in the high end of finance or something, or in the high end of the tech industry, well, even the tech industry, that's a surprising, the levels of how good a living can you make as a sort of fancy professor versus a reasonably fancy tech person. It's not as far off as it once was. And I think that's not a reason for dissuading a kid from you should do something where you can make a good living. Being a professor is not a bad living these days, I think. I think that it's let's see. Gosh, what are the questions here? Um, Jay is asking, how will new technology and especially generative AI changes of education, what role should parents play during this transition? You know, it's always good to know the tools of one's time. And, kids tend to learn them mostly fairly quickly. Although I get surprised all the time that, some tool will exist, some subpopulation of kids will start using that tool day it comes out. And some other kids will be like, well, my teacher didn't tell me to do this yet, so I'm not doing it. And they kind of live in this alternate universe where those tools don't exist. That's a thing where I think perhaps parents can help by like, well, let's go learn this tool together, for example. And or let's and just because your teacher didn't yet tell you to do that doesn't mean you can't learn this tool. If it is now and for the rest of time, that tool is going to exist, which tends to be the way it is. It's learn it now. Don't wait a decade to learn it until everybody else has overtaken you, so to speak, in learning that. And again, people can sometimes be in this mode where I'm just doing the 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps that I was told to do by my teacher, and that is the one thing I'm going to do. In a sense, that's an unfortunate way to go through school. The best ways to go through school involves, look, I just want to be there. I want to learn this stuff. This is fun type thing, rather than I'm doing this thing because I want to get my grade, because that will allow me to do the next thing and the next thing and so on. And eventually, you know, uh, 60 years later, I'll retire. And then what will you do? That's not clear. But, the kind of notion of I'm doing these steps just because I'm supposed to do these steps, that's an unfortunate way to end up. And one would, it's another thing I've found. I don't think I was as good at this when I was a kid as I have encouraged other people to be. So uh, uh, is the following, that, inside any subject that may at first seem kind of dull, there is probably something that kind of floats your boat. There is something interesting. Something, for example, when I was a kid, I learned a certain amount of history. I found it quite boring learning, which battle this person won against this country won against that country, and these kind of very sort of seemingly cut and dried kind of statements about how things really worked. Had I realized that many of those things are enmeshed with the history of technology, the history of science, which were topics that I was interested in from a young age, that would have really floated my boat. And I would have been, yeah, I want to know about what happened in this war or something in the 1700s, because gosh, I can see how that enmeshes with things about the history of technology that is something that I find interesting. So within subjects that even seem like they're, oh, this is kind of dull. It's, I think there are interesting things to find. And I think also by using new tools, both computational language and LLMs and the intersection between those two things and so on, it's kind of like you're able to go out and sort of explore more widely and capture things you're interested in, as well as the things that were sort of on the path you were supposed to do for the next exercise you were doing. I think that the concept of, oh, don't use that tool because because people haven't done it before. Don't use that tool because you won't really understand everything if you had a computer do it for you. I don't believe in that theory at all. In fact, I've seen in my own life the complete sort of contradiction of that theory. The fact that I've been able to do so many things by computer has allowed me to do many, many more things, and allowed me to get much stronger intuition for how those things work than if I had kind of ground out a small number of those things that I could do by hand. So it's been quite the reverse oh, I don't really understand what's going on because I didn't do it by hand. It's rather been because I can do it automatically and can do many more things of that type, I can understand it much better and get much better intuition for it. Let's see. Uh, um, Ali is asking, and this is actually the kind of thing I tend to talk about in different kind of live streams, but should one make infrastructure to think more creatively, logging one's thoughts, trying to dissect how one thinks about things? I will say that the effort to have a computer understand what I'm talking about, the effort to have other people understand what I'm talking about, those are important structuring elements in my way of thinking about things. It also is very useful to remember what you figured out and what you failed to figure out, or the mistakes you made in the past. I think that I've slowly learnt from my mistakes, so to speak. In many kinds of things that I do, like if I'm writing programs and things, there's certain types of mistakes I kind of knew I'd make. Or when I'm writing text, a mistake I often make is I write too quickly and I leave words out. And I know that I make these kinds of mistakes. And so that allows you to kind of work beyond your mistakes, so to speak, if you can remember if you can analyze what mistakes you made. But I'm not a big one for, using some elaborate system to diagram out my thinking. I really, honestly, have never done that. Some people find that kind of thing very useful. I find kind of the effort to explain it and the kind of the things that sort of explaining what I'm talking about to a computer to be really good ways to sort of structure what I'm thinking about. I have to say I'm thinking I'm in the process of doing a big refactoring of our company because there are just a whole bunch of new opportunities, and I'm realizing there's things we aren't so worth doing anymore, and there are a whole bunch of things that are really, really worth doing. And I'm trying to sort of take a very good pool of people and sort of move things around. And I'm realizing that the scale of moving things around is bigger than I can hold in my mind at one time. And so I've been sort of thinking to myself, maybe I should make myself a giant board where I have all the different groups that we have and people and projects and so on, and sort of start moving things around. I don't think I'm going to need to do that, but it's sort of getting close to that, because I realized that it's something where this is a thing which is just a bit too big for me to sort of hold all the pieces in my mind at one time. Let's see, Harry comments, in their experience, kids that should become scientists start asking, how do we know that, fairly early on? And for most adults, especially teachers, that's the hardest question. Yeah, well, kids, I think it's good for parents to ask kids when kids say, they make some statement. Somebody told them, I don't know, something like, the oceans are disappearing and volcanoes are getting bigger. It's like, how do you know that? Well, somebody said it. Well, okay, how could one know that? What would be a way of measuring that question? And that's a really good kind of conversation topic that sort of leads one in the direction of science kinds of things. I would say that the skeptical kid who says, how do we know that, is a rare case in my experience. Much more likely is, I heard that somewhere and that's a cool thing, and you sort of operate on the assumption that it's true. And some adults will say, maybe, how do you know that? How could you possibly know that? How could that possibly be known? And that then starts an interesting conversation. I've also noticed that, you can tell things even sometimes before people can tell them themselves. Like I've noticed that when you kind of give an explanation of something, and kids, for example, start dissecting that explanation and saying, I want it, really step by step, really sort of from an axiom. What's the fundamental axiom? What's the fundamental thing you're assuming? And then where do we build from there? That's a very minority collection of kids. And I think many of those kids will end up being pure mathematicians when they're grown up, because that's a style of thinking that is sort of characteristic and important in pure mathematics, but it's just not the typical way that people think about things. It's a different way of thinking about things, and it's just sort of a feature of people start out. All right, let's see. Maybe some technical questions here. Double says, I heard that physicists still don't understand how friction works. Is that true? Yeah, it's kind of true. it's been known for 400 years that the friction, so when you try and move one solid surface relative to another, there's a resistance to motion. And resistance to motion is bigger if you push down on the thing. So if there's more force sort of grinding these two surfaces together, the resistance to motion is larger. And normally, there's a law that says the friction force is a constant, the coefficient of friction, times the normal force, the force that you're pushing the thing down with, or the weight, the force that comes from just the thing having a certain mass and being pulled down by the force of gravity. So that rule, friction force is coefficient of friction times normal force. Nobody ever proved that rule. It isn't always true. It's there are deviations from that, but they're pretty small, and that's a pretty good principle. And for example, if you have surfaces in a vacuum, sometimes, well, it doesn't really work that way at all because the surfaces just stick together. And even, if you have glue or something in there, this rule that the force is the force that you can slide it with is proportional to normal force is nonsense. If the things got glued together, there's much more force than just the friction force times the normal force. But in a vacuum, things tend to stick much more readily. So why is it that things slide at all? You might think you've got these two solid surfaces. They've got surfaces of atoms on one surface, on the other surface. Why don't the atoms clearly are attracting each other? They're holding each other together because, after all, that's how a solid is held together, is by the attractive forces between atoms or molecules or whatever. So why is it that at the surface, the molecules of from one solid thing to the other solid thing don't just link up and make the solid bigger? Well, sometimes that does happen. That happens, that's sort of an instant weld, and it can happen between metals in a vacuum and things like this. But normally, there's sort of a complicated surface that has lots of sort of surface layers of stuff, oxides and things like this on it. By the way, you can make that surface layer kind of much more slippery by putting a lubricant like an oil or something in between those surfaces. Then it is no longer the case that the surface is just those atoms ready to become, to link up with their friendly solid atoms on the other side. But in general, the assumption is that solid surfaces tend to be very rough. They tend to not have, they tend to not be sort of a smooth layer of atoms. They tend to have sort of mountains and things on them. And so a reasonable hypothesis that may or may not be completely true is that if you have these two sort of mountainscapes, and they're both solid surfaces are kind of mountainscapes, that when you're not pushing very hard, it's just the tip of the tallest mountains that touches the other surface, so to speak. These are obviously tiny mountains, the size of small numbers of atoms and things, but we can think of them as sort of two microscopic mountainscapes. And then a theory would be, well, the harder you push down, the more that mountainscape is going to be deformed, and the larger the actual area of contact will be. It isn't just the tips of the mountains, it's you squashed it down. And so it was kind of, it's spread out, and you're now sort of connecting on the slope of the mountain as well as the tip of the mountain and so on. And that's kind of a theory for how that works. It's not clear how correct that is. And there are many features of friction that are complicated. One of them is the fact that to get things to start to move takes more effort than to get them to continue moving, the stick-slip phenomenon. And that phenomenon is important to practice in earthquakes, for example. It's why you can build up all this stress in a fault line in between tectonic plates and the Earth's surface, and you can build up all that stress, but they don't move, and then suddenly they overcome the static coefficient of friction and they start to move. And as they are moving, they don't immediately stop because the dynamic coefficient of friction is smaller, and they keep moving for a little while, and that's what leads to sort of the motion of the Earth in an earthquake. So yes, I think. Well, I'm trying to remember. There's been, the whole thing of sort of why friction works. Solids are the worst case. liquids, the analog of friction in liquid is viscosity, where that means that you start. How much effort does it take to start pouring that water? How much effort does it take to start pouring that syrup, whatever else? That is actually a much better understood phenomenon. That phenomenon is pretty well understood, and it has to do just with kind of the interactions between molecules, and kind of the more they're interacting, the more viscosity there's going to be. And the more, what viscosity is doing is, in the end, it's taking sort of systematic motion of a fluid, for example, where all the molecules are kind of going in the same direction, and it's kind of holding you back from that. It's making some of those molecules just, if the liquid is it's making, for example, if you start some motion in a liquid, like you make an eddy, then what damps out the eddy is viscosity. It's kind of friction-like forces in the liquid. And those friction-like forces are taking the energy that was associated with all that motion of the vortex going around, and they're kind of grinding down that energy to turn it into just heat, random motion of molecules, random microscopic motion of molecules. By the way, that's what's happening in solid friction as well, that the energy that is sort of pushing these things, that energy is being dissipated through friction into heat, into random motion of molecules, from the systematic motion of that whole block of metal or whatever that you were moving, down to the microscopic motion of molecules at the boundary. Let's see. I mean, friction is an interesting case of something where, it's in any textbook of mechanics. The formula F equals mu times n is there. And you say, why is that true? Well, nobody really quite knows why it's true. You could sort of say, well, it's an approximation, and it's inevitably that approximation, but actually it's not. I mean, the frictional force could be mu times the square root of the normal force or something. It doesn't have to be linearly proportional to the normal force, but that's a good approximation to what's actually seen. Let's see. Well, Mundaneum something is asking, how would you answer where this universe gets its expanding substance, in quotes, from? Well, it was observed in the 1920s that the universe is expanding. Galaxies sufficiently far away are receding from us at a certain rate. We right here aren't expanding, at least not relative to us. And our galaxy isn't expanding either. But if you get to galaxies that aren't gravitationally, galaxies that aren't like orbiting each other, galaxies further away than that, there's an overall flow, there's an overall sort of a push of expansion in the universe. Where'd that come from? Well, it came from the beginning of the universe. The Big Bang, the initial events at the beginning of the universe, they originally led to, in the usual model of cosmology, there's just this big sort of everything exploded and everything's been going outwards ever since. At what rate is it going outwards? Well, it could be that it's going outwards at a certain rate, but the force of gravity is going to pull it back in again. And eventually we're going to start with a big bang and end up with a big crunch as everything gets pulled back in again. Or it could be, as seems to be the case, that we're more or less at a place where the universe is expanding and the rate of expansion is going to be roughly a constant. It's neither going to contract nor is it going to expand even more than it has been expanding. There have been various times, particularly recently, when people have said, oh, the universe's expansion is increasing, the rate of expansion is increasing. It's been a little hard to explain that. And this concept of dark energy was introduced as a possible way to explain it. Essentially, dark energy, its name sounds cool and like that could really be a thing, but a different name for it would be negative mass matter, which makes it sound a little bit more weird. It is basically stuff that has negative mass. When things have ordinary positive mass, the force of gravity always attracts them together. If something had a negative mass, you would have anti-gravity and the thing would be pushed apart. And that's what this idea of dark energy is a thing that sort of exists as some form in the universe and pushes the universe apart. I think that I'm not sure that that's a real thing in our model of physics. There would be a way to get something like that, but we don't know that it's there. And I'm not sure that the experiments are really supporting its existence in a convincing way. There are lots of difficult to interpret and difficult to do experiments around that. So that's kind of the story, that there's not, if you ask the question, the sort of vacuum of space and how is it expanding, in traditional views of physics, the vacuum sort of kind of has nothing in it. Actually, for the last 100 years, it's been known that the vacuum kind of has something in it. It has virtual particles, it has virtual particle-antiparticle pairs, an infinite number of them that are constantly popping into existence and then disappearing again. It's kind of a version of the quantum uncertainty principle. You can't know how many particles you have there. And so there's sort of particles constantly appearing and disappearing. They're not things that we have a sense of, partly because they're everywhere. And so we can't kind of distinguish. It's only the changes that we perceive, so to speak. So that's in traditional physics from the last 100 years. In our physics project, we kind of understand more, I think, about what the structure of space is. And space is really this kind of giant network of kind of atoms of space. And what's happening is this network is constantly being rewritten. And that's kind of the way that the structure of space is, and the way the sort of different parts of space get knitted together by the fact that they're sort of two nearby pieces of space are involved in the same rewriting process. And then one of those is involved in another rewriting process. And gradually, you're sort of spreading the connection between these different parts of space across space. And in that kind of setup, the concept that there is expansion in space, in the content of the universe, possibly has a more direct form. It doesn't need to, but it seems likely that it has a more direct form, that the actual number of atoms of space, the number of nodes in this network, is actually increasing over time. That seems likely, but not certain. One of the more bizarre possibilities is that it's actually increasing incredibly rapidly, so rapidly that if we were going to do an experiment to see that space is discrete, by the time we actually get to an experiment that operates on a certain scale, the doing of that experiment would take sufficiently long that in that very time, the universe would have expanded more, subdivided more, and we'd never kind of get to the end. We'd never be able to chase the subdivision of the universe to find out, aha, the universe really is discrete there. Let's see. Meekan asks, would you be open to the possibility of other mathematics than the one we currently use? What do you think about that? Well, we have certain constructs in mathematics, like numbers, like integers and so on. We have other constructs, like geometrical figures. We have other constructs that are more elaborate, like the theory of types, or algebraic varieties, or other kinds of complicated mathy things. And math has chosen to study certain kinds of constructs. Things like integers, whole numbers, are things where we can readily see, oh, we kind of know what that means because we can count rocks or chickens or whatever else. Things that are much more abstract, like infinite sets or something like this, we don't have as much kind of immediate real-world connection to those things. But mathematics, in the last particularly 100 and something years, has very much studied a bunch of kind of abstract things that don't really have an immediate connection to what we're used to experiencing in the world. So kind of the mathematics that's been built, some of it originated back in antiquity. It originated with things that really did seem to relate to the real world, geometrical figures, numbers, things like this. As mathematics progressed, and particularly at the end of the 19th century, it kind of went more abstract and started studying things that were mere abstract constructs, not really connected to things in the real world. So at the level of those abstract constructs, one can study all kinds of things. In fact, I've even done that. I've tried to enumerate kind of all possible mathematics. What are the possible kinds of underpinnings that you could make a mathematics out of? And there are an infinite number of those things, and you can study each one of them. And each one has a rich structure. You could spend, a lifetime. You could write 100 books about each one of those possible mathematics. The question is, do we care? And that question is a complicated question because it's partly one thing that might make us care is, oh, we can see this thing in the physical world that works like that. Another thing that might make us care is, oh, lots of humans have thought that's cool, and so that's a direction we want to explore. But it's more of a kind of, it's a combination of the natural world and the kind of social world that determine sort of which of these mathematics are worth pursuing. And I can certainly mention sort of mathematics that haven't really made it. I mean, the theory of combinators, for example, is something that has remained obscure, if powerful, ever since they were invented in 1920. That could have an elaborate mathematics associated with it. It hasn't really yet. It has a bunch of studies have been done on it. I wrote a book about those things a few years ago, things like that. But it is something that is rich enough that sort of the full sort of dynamic of the 10,000 books that get written in different areas of mathematics could have been written about. It just hasn't been at this point. And it's a dynamic that particular areas of math get explored, particular ways of formulating math get explored, and others do not. Should one go out and explore random arbitrary areas of mathematics? It's kind of fun to do it. I think it's closely related to what I call ruleology, the study of simple rules and what they do. Can one justify it on the basis of something where we're going to say, this is going to make us technology, or this is going to give us a better understanding of the natural world? I'm not sure one can. If one says, is it as justifiable as something which was otherwise studied in mathematics? That's more of a sort of social question. And it's like, well, this thing hasn't really had many people studying it. Maybe that's a good reason to study it if you want to do something different from other people. But it hasn't been as validated by the fact that people have studied it yet. Let's see. Michael is asking, do you think the emergence of AI marks the end of curiosity or the beginning of an era where curiosity will grow even greater because it will be satisfied? Well, maybe it's just me as the optimist of doing things that I like to do, but I feel like the more access we have to information, the more ability we have to compute things, the more leverage we have, the further we can reach, the more satisfying it is to try and reach places. And I think that the thing that I've seen back from 50 years ago, it's like you started to be able to do online searching of scientific papers. And that was very useful in kind of opening up, oh, there were things I didn't know about, and I found it from doing the search. Let me go explore that. That was a thing that really liberated some part of doing exploration. And I think the same is true with LLMs. Now you can go sort of have them explore for you. Well, there were a million papers about this subject. Tell me the trend of this or that thing, and the LLM will say something that is probably statistically correct in some sense. So, I mean, I think I'm very bullish on the fact that there are more tools for satisfying curiosity, and that's going to just lead to more curiosity. At least it will do for me, I think. And I think it perhaps will for many other people as well. I mean, I would say that the existence of the web has increased curiosity. Things where you could only find that fact by going and finding a person to ask or finding the reference book in the library. I think many more people are interested in looking up facts and learning things and being curious about things now because of the web, because I would like to think of things like Wolfram and so on as well, than were before, because the fact that that is so accessible means that you can satisfy that curiosity and go on and build another level of curiosity beyond that. Let's see. Looking at the questions here, so many. There's a question from Anatolian. What effect do you think wide-scale adoption of LLMs will have on the boundary of the knowable? I think that it is not a question of the knowable. It's a question of what you know, that is, or what you can know as a person, so to speak. We have a certain limited memory in those 100 billion neurons that we all have. It's we can store a certain amount. But our civilization, as in the aggregate, has made much more knowledge than any one person can store. And so the question is, to what extent can you sort of plug into the collective mind and make use of what has been figured out there? And I think that LLMs sort of help to plug you into the sort of collective mind. I mean, the same has been true of computational language tools we build. Actually, that does more than that. Not only does it give one what is already known, it gives one a tool to go find out things that aren't known before. LLMs are much more sort of giving you access to the knowable, so to speak. And I think that's their role in science, is much more accessing the knowable than it is kind of building what has been unknown before. I think that and so in terms of the sort of boundary of knowledge, I do think quite a lot of new knowledge comes from kind of refactoring knowledge that's existed before. And I think that's going to become easier to do. I think when sort of online searching for scientific references became possible, that let one kind of probe more parts of the academic literature and so on than one was able to do before. Now that's expanded greatly, and we're able to kind of go and plug into this kind of collective knowledge, collective mind that existed. Let's see. Quantum is asking, how do you feel about integrating 3D models, animations, and so on into learning science? For example, having a 3D model as an output or an animation of a flight path instead of just numbers and plain text on paper. Well, I mean, story of my life for the last, 45 years has been make pictures of things by computer. And yeah, that's incredibly powerful. Being able to visualize things is incredibly powerful. There is so much more that we can absorb with our eyes than that we can understand in words through language, so to speak. Language is a great way for us to specify things. It's kind of more information can be conveyed in pictures, and generating those kinds of pictures to get a sort of a view of what things look like is crucial. It's, without that, so many things I've done, so many things that the tools I built have enabled for other people wouldn't have been possible. The sort of visualization of things is a critical piece of the story. Now, that's particularly true of things where you look at it and it's a picture, and you can kind of examine the different parts of the picture, and it's just a flat picture. That's very, very powerful. There are two directions you can go. One is you make a 3D picture, and the other is you are using, well, animations, virtual reality, things like this. But to me, animations are sometimes useful. I have to say, I think a good one-time picture sort of beats out the animations, even if the one-time picture involved this kind of set of movie frames to show what happened. Why is that? I mean, sometimes the animation is valuable for some kinds of processes where things are going on and you never see how things were related to each other unless you could see the animation. But sometimes people make animations because they're kind of cool and they sort of look good for the first 5 seconds. But in the end, if you want to understand what's going on, it's really hard to understand what's going on because, the animation started this way and 2 seconds later, it's looking like something different. You can't really remember how the thing that looks now relates to the thing that came before and so on. So, I have found my experience that sort of sometimes, too often, animations become a crutch for make this thing look cool, so to speak. There are places where animation has a role, particularly when one is visualizing sort of physical processes which we're used to seeing in motion. But I think that being able to sort of see the relationship of things is much easier when you can kind of examine it with your eyes, so to speak. Oh, that's the top, that's what happened next. Let me go back to how it got that way and so on. And even when you have something which is like an animated picture in 2D, being able to sort of extrude that into 3D and have a whole stack that shows you sort of the relationship between the different 2D frames, I found that really useful as well. when it comes to sort of 3D and kind of knowing what things look like in 3D, things that we're used to from the real world, seeing them sort of in 3D with some perspective and things like this is useful. When they're things that are really quite alien to the world as we normally understand it, things, surfaces from mathematics, kinds of visualizations of data that we've never seen versions of before, it can often be very confusing, very difficult to understand what is it that's happening in this 3D picture. And people, years ago, people sort of said, well, make them look realistic. Put, a marble texture on that object. That didn't work out very well. It actually was better to just put, a grid of lines on the surface, because that gives you a much better sense of kind of what's near what, and so what's near and what's far, and so on, in our typical way of visualizing things. So in 3D, it's often really useful to be able to pick up the thing and just wiggle it around a bit, just to get some sense in your mind of kind of what it looks like from different angles, because that allows you to build up in your mind this image of a 3D object. That's, if the goal is to understand the shape of the 3D object, that's very useful. Again, if the thing is sort of very close to something that we're used to, then seeing it in kind of a 3D version of it is useful for understanding it. When it comes to things like VR and so on, gosh, well, it's a strange thing, because over the last, 35 years, there have been a series of times when people have said VR is going to be critical for understanding this or that thing. There are certain use cases. I mean, if you're, for a while it looked like understanding buildings and, what is it like to be in this space and so on. That might be really useful. I think one that maybe is emerging as a real thing is molecules, complicated molecules. If you're a person who's developing drugs, for example, and you want to figure out, does this molecule that I'm studying, does it dock into this hole in this other molecule? What prevents it from docking? What makes it sort of so it can't reach its target and make the person, cure that disease or whatever else? Well, let me visualize what these molecules are like. Why does this little molecule not get in through this particular crevice and do this thing? Oh, well, if I can visualize it in 3D, I see that there's this phosphorus atom that's sticking in the way. Let me try and design a new molecule that has that way cleared, and so on. So I think that's an example of a modern use case. I don't really know how well that's going to develop, but that's a modern use case where sort of the VR thing is helpful. Again, I think that the value of that in sort of for I think educational purposes and so on, there's a certain coolness factor, and coolness is worth having, because it's like, in addition to the fact that I learned what the different platonic solids were like today, I also saw them using this cool, 3D virtual reality mechanism that helps kind of cement the remembering what the thing is like, that you saw them in this setting that was somehow ambiently cool, so to speak. And I think that's a reason why that's worthwhile. Let's see. Jason asks, how do you think about encryption in the age of AI and LLMs? It seems like they will be able to pick up the patterns with ease once exposed. Well, no. I mean, what AIs do is similar to the way that human brains work. And things we find easy to do, they'll now find easy to do. For a long time, things that we found easy to do, like say, this is a picture of a cat versus a dog, computers found really, really hard to do. That's now been solved. We've got computer systems that are sort of enough like us that things which we find really easy to do, they find easy to do as well. Breaking an encryption system is not something we find easy to do. Recognizing those subtle computational patterns that allow you to take the encrypted version of a message that's been sort of ground up and apparently randomized and invert it to get back the original plain text that you can read, that's something that is not a thing human minds do well. And it's not a thing we can expect that LLMs and AIs will do well either. And in fact, they don't. And in fact, we can expect as a general matter that as soon as you're kind of using irreducible amounts of computation, in doing the encryption or setting it up so that you need sort of irreducible amounts of computation to break the encryption, that's just not something that the AIs are going to be able to reach. So that's not a thing that they're going to kind of be sensitive to. Now, as a practical matter, when you protect computer systems, the problem of sort of doing the cryptography has been pretty well solved for a long time, until or unless some bizarre and unexpected algorithmic piece of progress is made that suddenly allows one to do computations one thought were hard more easily, but there's no evidence that that's going to happen. But typically, if you've got a computer system and somebody's breaking into your computer system, they didn't do it by breaking the cryptography. That is a very, very rare thing. And really, I think it's fair to say that when it comes to computer systems, breaking the cryptography is something that's probably only done by governments and really not by anybody else. It takes, if one is doing it at all, it takes huge resources to be able to do it. But what is the vastly more common way that computer systems are broken into is through social engineering of some kind. Somebody gets somebody to click on that link that's a phishing link, and that allows people to break into the computer, or somebody calls somebody on the phone and convinces them to give them their password over the phone or something like this. Those kinds of things that are sort of hacking the humans, so to speak, to get things to happen. Well, that's a place where LLMs, that's a place where things, I think, will change sort of in the AI world, because, it's like somebody's calling you and convincing you of things and so on. Well, the AIs can learn a fair amount about how to convince people of things. The voices are pretty realistic. It's starting to be like, is this real? Is this not real? And the idea that the AIs will learn how to manipulate us to convince us that you really should give this password to somebody over the phone or whatever else it is, I think that's a much higher risk. And I think that we can already see the AIs in effect manipulating us. We have done for years in things like ranking of social media content, where the AIs are manipulating us to kind of click more, monetize more ads and so on. That's a place where that is a sort of an AI system that has been set to have that task, but it is managing to do that in a way where it's sort of manipulating us. And I think that's much more the risk from LLMs and so on for computer security than sort of actually breaking the cryptography, which requires this sort of irreducible computation that really isn't achievable with LLMs any more than it's achievable with any other kind of computer system. Let's see. This is a weird question, but weird is interesting. From Tennis, is it possible to build a compact mechanical SHA-256 encryption device that will be resistant to solar flares? Interesting question. Well, let's take apart that question. So SHA-256 is a particular protocol for doing encryption where you give this sort of key of 256 ones and zeros, and then you're kind of grinding up a piece of data with actually SHA-256 is more a hashing scheme where you're grinding up the data, and you're taking a piece of data and you're saying you're assigning a number to any piece of data. You're assigning some number to it. And so a typical kind of thing that you might do, like the way that Bitcoin works, is to try and say, find a piece of data such that the number that comes out from the hashing procedure has a particular form, like it starts with a whole bunch of zeros, let's say. And that problem is really hard. And that's what Bitcoin mining has endless computers grinding away, trying to solve that rather meaningless, but nevertheless sort of apparently guaranteed hard problem. But let's imagine that you've got some device that's using this algorithm and so on, and will it be resistant to solar flares? Well, electronics has the feature that it's got little electrical signals in it, and if there is something that is a big electrical signal, like a lightning strike, for example, then that electronics can be just thrown completely off because it's using 6-volt voltages and so on, and that's what the computer is operating with. And then along comes a 10,000 volt you know, a little offshoot of some lightning or something, and it's going to throw that completely off. A thing that's a bit like that is what happens with material that comes from the sun, like coronal mass ejections, big chunks of plasma kind of fire from the surface of the sun that gets sort of thrown out into space and sometimes gets to be close to the Earth. And what happens there is that this moving lump of electrically charged material produces an electrical effect on satellites, for instance. And the satellites that aren't sort of in the shadow of the Earth, the satellites that are sort of on the side of the Earth that's pointing towards the sun, can get a big dose of those electrical effects, and that can kind of throw the electronics of the satellites kind of off course, and you have to kind of there are a variety of ways to deal with that, from putting the electronics in various kinds of cages that sort of keep out these electromagnetic effects, to using different kinds of electronics, to just having everything computed twice or three times and taking the majority vote of what should happen, and so on. In terms of making something sort of a thing that's resistant to electrical interference, that's an interesting question, whether you could do that mechanically. We now have things like MEMS, which are microscopic mechanical sort of actuators used for, well, gosh, a lot of things like you can make a projector where there's a mirror, where instead of it always reflecting the same way, every little piece of the mirror is made from one of these MEMS, and it, depending on whether it has an electric voltage applied to it, it will move in a different direction, so it will reflect the light or not reflect the light. But so there's a question of, could you make something out of these kind of mechanical devices that sort of doesn't involve electricity? I think most of the methods that are at all efficient do involve electricity as sort of a carrier level layer, even between sort of the mechanical processes of these MEMS and so on. So I'm not hopeful about that. Whether you could make a clockwork computer that will do encryption, well, yeah, people had that. That was what the Enigma machine in World War II was. It was a clockwork machine that, well, almost clockwork. It had some electrical pieces as well. But in a first approximation, it was a clockwork machine that will do encryption. Can one make a much more elaborate clockwork machine? Sure, one can. And in today's world with 3D printing and all that, it's become ever easier to make a much more elaborate mechanical device that will do some kind of computation. I don't know. It'd be interesting to work out how big a mechanical device you would need that, in sort of purely in clockwork, does one of these encryption schemes. It's kind of like the clockwork version of a Bitcoin mining operation. I think Bitcoin mining operations are loud enough at the best of times, let alone having them clank cogs and gears and so on to do it mechanically. All right, I think I have to go back to my day job here. But thank you for all kinds of interesting questions, and I see many more even at the beginning that I didn't get to. So I hope to have a chance to tackle them another time. So thanks for now, and talk to you another time.